Well, it's not the mother of all talk shows, but it is going to be the mother of all drive time shows. I'll be talking Brexit, and I'll be talking Sir Philip Green, as he now is, and as he seems to be determined to remain. Sir Philip Green, you'll remember him, the man who purloined the workers' pensions and caused them to be thrown onto the unemployment heap before retreating to one of two £100 million yachts. But about him more later. Bigger fish to catch in the interim, starting with the biggest fish of them all. In fact, the great white whale, that is President Donald Trump. Let me put my cards firmly on the table, as I always do. Donald Trump's travel ban is foolish and dangerous. It's foolish because it deliberately excludes Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, which are in fact the fountainhead of terrorism. They are the place where the terrorism is armed, is funded, and is given its ideological and theological ammunition. So, a Muslim travel ban that excludes Saudi Arabia is simply bonkers. And don't forget that 13 of the 19 hijackers that murdered thousands of Americans on 9/11 in the name of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were, in fact, Saudis. In fact, more people have been killed in North America by supporters of Donald Trump than have been killed by refugees in America in the last decade. That's a pretty telling statistic, don't you think? Because in Quebec, I mention it because you will not have heard much mention of it. You will not have seen many Canadian flags illuminating the Eiffel Tower. You will not have seen the Canadian flag up everywhere on Facebook. You will not see people changing their avatars to Canadian flags to commemorate the murder, yes, murder, of 6 Muslims at prayer and leaving of 5 in intensive care and wounding 60 others in a mosque in Quebec by a man who described himself as a supporter of Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen. You will not have heard very much about that. So, actually, refugees haven't harmed anybody in America. But that's not just why it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it has and it will increase extremization, fanaticization of Muslims across the globe. It will give another chip on the shoulder of people with more than enough chips already on their shoulders at the injustice and double standards to which they have been subjected. It will deepen the swamp from which terrorism comes. And that's why I oppose it. I oppose Trump's travel ban because it's foolish and dangerous. However, there is no sight more repugnant to me than the sight of the hypocrite. The sight of the marcher denouncing Donald Trump revoking people's visas when they didn't give a damn. Not a damn. When President Barack Obama was dropping a bomb every 20 minutes of the last 8 years. Every 20 minutes of the last 8 years. On 5 of the 7 countries on Donald Trump's travel ban. And that's not an accident either, because actually it's not Donald Trump's list, it's Barack Obama's list. Now, Trump has insulted in the most vulgar way lots of people, women, ethnic minorities, Mexican people. Okay, he's a vulgar brute, okay? But he hasn't been dropping bombs on people every 20 minutes. It was Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and George Bush and Bill Clinton before him that created this gigantic swamp of hatred and bitterness from which this terrorism has emerged. So, if you're on the march and you're more than 19, then you need to ask yourself, how come the revoking of some visas is regarded as more sinful than all the crimes of all these other presidents put together. And ask yourself a second thing. How come the so-called mainstream media is giving such fantastic coverage to the anti-Trump protests when we were protesting outside their window? The BBC, 100,000 of us, 2 years ago, we were outside their window protesting at their coverage of the carnage in Gaza. All they had to do was open the window and stick a television camera out and put us on the news, but they didn't. They ignored the fact that the demonstration even happened. How come then it's such big news that people have taken to the streets in lower, smaller numbers than that to protest against Donald Trump? I'll tell you why. The reason the establishment hates Trump is not because he's a vulgarian, not because he's a sexist or a racist. They hate Trump because he says, he might not do it, but he says he wants to turn down the dial on hostility and aggression between the United States and Russia. He says, he might not do it, that he wants to stop supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. And he wants to cooperate with Russia and Syria in extirpating the worst people on the earth, namely ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I'll tell you another reason why. Because Trump doesn't like NATO very much. He doesn't actually want to be part of a military confrontation with Russia or whomsoever NATO chooses as its next adversary, its next enemy. That's the real reason. That's the reason the war party in the United States Congress doesn't like him. It's why John McCain doesn't like him. It's not because he's a sexist or because he's a racist. John McCain chose Sarah Palin as his running mate when he ran for president. He hates Trump because Trump doesn't hate Russia enough. The NATO generals, the EU bureaucrats, the military-industrial complex, grown fat on decades of confrontation, invasion, occupation, and war. They hate Trump because, well, hey, if there are no wars going on in the world, well, that's not good for business. And the media, the echo chamber of the neoliberal political elite establishment in this country and in other countries, they hate Trump for the same reason. You see, they loved Bill Clinton. Do you remember Bill? Do you remember the Count of Monte Cristo? You remember Bill Clinton and the interns and the stain on the dress and all that? Well, that is forgotten and forgiven because Bill was cool, see? Bill was Elvis. He could do what he liked. Barack Obama, very cool, very clever, very handsome, nice to his wife, put his umbrella up for his wife. The fact that he was blowing people's heads off every 20 minutes for 8 years, well, the Liberals don't care so much about that. And I have a duty, an obligation to point out the hypocrites, the last of whom I'm going to mention. Somebody called Madeleine Albright. She was Bill Clinton's Secretary of State. She became infamous, although the young and those with a poor memory have forgotten this. I'm going to remind you. She was asked by Leslie Stahl on ABC News in the United States, who asked, Secretary Albright, 560,000 Iraqi children have died under these sanctions. That's a very high price, isn't it? And Madeleine Albright replied, in words that will follow her surely into the fires of hell. She answered, it is, but we think it's a price worth paying. So killing 560,000 children is a price worth paying. But hey, revoking somebody's visa, that's a step too far. Let me finish with this. Nobody has a right to go to America or any other country. Anybody who goes to anybody's country does so with permission from that country. Nobody, at least most of those who do, has a need to go to America. And frankly, I wouldn't want to. But the reality is, if Donald Trump stays out of other people's countries, if he stays out of invading and occupying other people's countries, if he stops the decades of United States interference in other people's affairs, frankly, I'll be very happy. Now, my first guest is, like myself, a former politician, a former congressman, and like myself, now a talk show host, although he talks to even more people than me because his show is syndicated across 8 American radio stations. He's Joe Walsh, and I'm very, very happy that he joins me now. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Hey, George, it's great to be with you. I am a recovering politician.
You and me both. Although we might
Yeah.
both be back, Joe, so never say never. Never spit in the well in case we've got to drink from it again. Joe, all hell has broken loose here. All the Liberals are on the march against Donald Trump. All the people that missed all the crimes of the last 8 years of President Obama have suddenly woken up because your president has, in a rather ham-fisted and foolish way, in my opinion, issued a travel ban. How does it look from your side of the Atlantic?
Hey, George, it's a mess. Look, America is divided, my friend. I say often, and I supported Trump, we got Trump because everything in America is broken. Our politics is broken. The Republican Party is horrible. The Democrat Party is horrible. The media is terrible. Everything broke, and along comes this crazy guy named Trump, and that's where we are.
Well, I couldn't have put that better myself. That's exactly my own view. Let's deal with the list first. How on earth can you have a list of countries from which terrorists might come that doesn't include Saudi Arabia, which is the nest, the head of the snake? It's the fountainhead of all this terrorist extremism.
You're right. It's silly. Saudi Arabia and a few other countries, George, should be on the list. Now, Trump got this list of 7 countries from Obama, but clearly Saudi Arabia and others should be on it. There's talk that maybe because Trump has business interests in Saudi Arabia, they're not on the list. But if you're going to be serious about what Trump wants to do, then it's got to be broader-based, more broad-based to these 7 countries.
Now, Joe, the latest is the nomination of a, they call it controversial, member of the Supreme Court. They're always controversial, of course, because the court is very finely balanced between what they call liberals and what they call conservatives. What can you tell us about this new nominee?
He's a conservative. And look, this is elections matter. This is the one area, George, in America where a presidential election matters, because whoever the president is, they can put their guy on the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, in America, the damn courts have too much influence. We've placed so much. Both sides try to advance their policy agenda through the courts instead of through the ballot box. So this Supreme Court pick is a big choice. He will replace Antonin Scalia, who was a conservative. And by all indications, this guy is every bit as conservative. So for somebody like me, it's great, but this is why elections matter.
How do you pronounce his name? Is it Gorsuch?
Gorsuch, you did that very well.
Well, I'm a Scotsman, you see, so I can do so. He goes up now, and who has to validate that? Is it the Senate or the Congress or both?
So just the Senate, not the House. So just the Senate will confirm. The Democrats will try to filibuster, which means it would take 60 votes to approve them. And then the Republicans might have to decide, do we just get rid of the filibuster? So it could get ugly in the Senate.
Yeah, it's already turning ugly, isn't it? The Democrats walked out of the hearings for several of the cabinet members. Is that unprecedented, Joe, or has that happened before?
No, it's happened before. And what's interesting, George, is you're right, they walked out, but the Republicans on that committee this morning approved the nominees even without the Democrats there. That's never been done before. Hey, look, it may seem crazy from over there, but I want to tell you something, George. America right now things are chaotic. We're on fire right now. It's like nobody thought Trump would win. Trump didn't even think he'd win. And now the Democrats and the liberals have woken up. We are in for 4 years of protest and warfare.
It definitely looks like, I mean, I've been following the United States politics, believe me, for half a century since I was a child. I was brought up in a house that venerated Jack Kennedy as the first Catholic president of the United States and so on. So for half a century, I've been following American politics. I've never known a period like this of such volatility, such lack of acceptance of the legitimacy of the president, and such an atmosphere almost of revolution in the air, no?
Oh, George, if I were there, I'd give you a big kiss on your forehead. I have said for 5 years, we are going through a third American revolution. I really believe that. Trump's victory was a giant middle finger to the entire political establishment in this country. People sent Trump to D.C., literally, George, to tear that place down and start over. I mean, we are talking about real rebellious times right now.
Yes, it does seem that way. And speaking of Jack Kennedy, if I were Trump, I'd avoid grassy knolls. I wouldn't be going out on any open car motorcades. I'd be employing guards to guard my guards, if you know what I mean.
I know what you mean, George. Yes, he will not go out in public without a whole heck of a lot of security, that's for sure.
Joe, it's been a pleasure talking to you. The phone wasn't great, but the conversation was. Thanks very much. Joe Walsh.
George. God bless you. Thank you.
And you, former congressman and American talk show host across eight stations. Let's take the first caller of the show, and it's Denise in Boreham Wood. Denise, go ahead.
Hello, George.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. Are we talking about, you specifically talking about the Nigerian woman that gave birth to the 4 babies on the National Health Service? Is that what we're focusing on today?
No, we're talking about the Donald Trump travel ban. That's a long way from that story, Denise.
Okay. Right. Yes, the travel ban. I do agree with Donald Trump because all America has for a long time suffered a lot of losing their way. And I believe the American people voted for this. Some of them did. And he's doing exactly what he said he would do. And I do believe it's a good thing to do. It's right to do it.
And does it matter to you that, as a matter of fact, these policies, this list, was actually drawn up by Barack Obama? So Saudi Arabia, for example, isn't on it, even though most of the terrorists come from there. Should they be on it too?
I think they should.
Well, my point of view is this, that every country, and that includes the United States, has an obligation, a legal obligation, never mind a moral one, to take their fair share of refugees. Refugees and immigrants are two different things. Every country has the right to decide who can immigrate into its territory, but every country has a legal and moral responsibility to take refugees, and that obligation becomes more onerous if you are one of the countries that are bombing and making war in places that are causing the refugees to flee. So whilst you may be right about Trump's right to limit immigration from certain parts of the world, the American people have that right, like we do, like any other country does. but he doesn't have a right to shut the door on refugees, not at least if he wants to obey the law.
Well, I think there's too many of them. It's all out of control. Everything is out of control. And there has to be a stop point to it, or else it will become outright. It'll become, really, it'll be everywhere. There's got to be a stop point to it. And I think he's going to do a good job.
But what shall the refugees do then? Sink into the sea?
I can't answer that. I've been trying to think of a solution for that.
I'll give you the solution.
I think really...
Denise, I'll give you the solution. If we stop making war everywhere and always, there'll be fewer refugees. Most of the 80% of the refugee flow over the last 3 years have come from Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. And you don't need to be a genius to work out what these three countries have in common. They have all been the scene of gigantic wars waged by, variously, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and other countries. So if you don't want refugees, what you need to do is stop bombing people and forcing them to take to the roads as refugees.
That is true, but the IS, how have they come about? These are the people now that are bombing their own people.
Exactly.
And this is why they're all coming over here.
Well, first of all, Denise, most refugees have nothing to do with IS. They are fleeing from IS. And if you ask me, and as it happens, I know the answer. Where did IS came from? They came from Al-Qaeda. Where did Al-Qaeda come from? They multiplied, proliferated as a result of the Bush and Blair attack on Iraq, as many of us predicted they exactly would.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that is very true. And that is why it's a shame that he wasn't, there from the beginning, because Bush and Blair are bad people. They've caused all this, I agree.
Denise, it's been great talking to you. Go ahead, Julian.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me on the show.
Welcome.
Just before I start, I would like to thank you for that great speech you gave in America. It was one of the best and funniest I've ever heard.
Thank you. Yes, that was a long time ago now, 2005, so 12 years ago.
As you went up Capitol Hill with your Cuban cigar.
Yeah, I no longer smoke, but I'm glad to say I smoked a Cuban cigar in the American Senate House.
Good lad. Right, a bit slightly different. There should be a lot more countries on the prescribed list, but don't you think we're being lied to on a scale by mainstream media, that particularly the BBC and others, they've become the equivalent of the TASS news agency under the Soviet Union?
Well, the BBC would make TASS blush with the enthusiasm with which they endorse the very latest of state wheezes. But yes, of course we're being lied to systematically, marched into war after war after war by a political class that has a media echo chamber, which treats anyone who speaks up against the prevailing orthodoxy as if they were bad or mad, or in my case, both.
Yeah. This is the point I'm trying to get at, and particularly in Syria, they've claimed that they're going in there on a humanitarian grounds when there's awful dictators around the world in the Middle East and through Africa that do horrendous things, and as long as they're an American puppet, nothing seems to happen to them.
Well, let me commend to you the very best of articles on this by Patrick Coburn of The Independent, that's Cockburn, of The Independent, writing today in the London Review of Books. So if you're on Twitter, that's at LRB. In a very substantial piece of work, Patrick Coburn proves beyond any contradiction, that not for 100 years, that's 100 years, has the British people been lied to so systematically and comprehensively by the news media as they have been over Syria. It has been a gigantic conspiracy against truth. And now that the facts and the truth are slowly becoming clear as the fog of war clears as ISIS and Al-Qaeda are defeated, Patrick goes through line by line all the lies that we were told, all the obfuscation, the distortion that we suffered. And I personally can never forgive the people who call themselves journalists who participated in that. It was one of the biggest hoaxes in all history.
In all of mankind.
Well, look, Julian, thanks for the call. I appreciate it. Let's go to the next caller, who is Simon in London. Simon, welcome.
Good afternoon, George.
And to you, sir, what would you like to say?
I want to talk about two things, if possible. First one is Trump and his domestic issues.
Yes.
Not the immigration issue, but the Dakota Access Pipeline, which he gave his blessings to.
Yeah.
This is going to explode in his face because it's very contentious.
Yes.
What happened was when Obama was in office, there was a lot of pressure from his base to go against this, but he didn't. The only thing that pushed him to act was the amassing of 4,000 war veterans who went out to protect the water protectors. Once they started to mobilize and march, being led by, I think, somebody called Clark Jr., it became an issue which he could no longer kick into the long grass, so he had to put his weight to cancel the pipeline. What Trump has done now is he's given open blessing and he's shown he doesn't care about certain environmental issues. But what he doesn't understand is this is a very contentious issue because it's being upheld not by just liberal lefties and environmentalists, but veterans who aren't happy at the sight of Native Americans being attacked by police whilst they're protecting the water. And Trump came into office talking about he wants to do everything he can for veterans. How is it going to look when he's facing off against veterans who are standing in the middle of Native American water protectors and police?
Well, more power to their elbow. I have been supporting the original Americans in their stand over their land all of my life. My mother said she knew I was going to grow up different because I was the only boy she ever knew that was always on the side of the Indians against the cowboys. So you don't have to persuade me of that. Although Obama, of course, it was under Obama that this pipeline project began. Hillary Clinton was committed to it as well.
Yeah,
and Trump,
absolutely.
So there was bipartisan support for this pipeline. The only thing different is that Obama signed permission for the pipelines to go ahead as long as they were built with American steel. Now, of course, the capitalists would rather build the steel, or buy the steel rather, from China or from Vietnam because it's very much cheaper there. But Trump insists that the steel is American and steel mills are opening up again in the United States. I spoke to a radio host from Ohio who was making the point last Friday that some of the closed down steel mills along Lake Erie are going to be opening up again because of this decision. So I'm against the pipeline. At least I'm against it with the failure to reach agreement with the local people. And the local people in this case have already suffered enough. Simon, been fantastic talking to you. It wasn't a great line, but it was a good conversation. Now, my next guest is Michael Graham, who's a political commentator in Washington, D.C., and he's kindly agreed to join us on the show tonight. He's a different political perspective, I think, to the last American we had on 20 minutes ago. Let's see if I'm right about that. Michael, welcome to the show.
You certainly are right, Mr. Galloway, and I love hearing how you pronounce my last name correctly. I don't get Graham pronounced correctly very often here in the States.
Okay, well, I'm a Scotsman, so it's second nature to me. Michael, if the Democrats had chosen Bernie Sanders, none of this would be happening, would it?
I think you may very well be right. You know, I was not a Trump fan. There are a lot of reasons not to like him. It was interesting. Just today, I saw a protest, a photo from the protest back during the primary. We were putting a montage together for the Washington Examiner where I work, and there was a Go Bernie sign right next to a No TPP sign. And of course, we all laughed because who just killed America's involvement in the TPP? It's the left's arch enemy, the evil villain, Dr. Trump.
Well, certainly he's the liberals' worst enemy. We'll talk again objectively about whether he's the left's worst enemy, because from the point of view of the working class in America, in the insultingly called Rust Belt seats, what Trump is doing, I've just been talking about the pipeline, the Dakota pipeline, insisting it's built with American steel, cancelling TPP, promising whatever the cost in deficit terms to pave America with infrastructure, and to penalize capitalist companies, corporations who move their jobs out of the U.S. On economic issues, Trump is running to the left of Obama, not the right.
Well, he's talking to the left of the way President Obama spoke, but if you look at the way the president governed, for example, having the government of the United States take over 1/6 of the entire economy through the failed Obamacare plan, I mean, there's no doubt that on certain areas they're fellow travelers, if you don't mind me using that phrase. But the problem we have is economic sanity. For example, could you explain to me the economic sanity of not building the pipelines from the Canadian oil sands to bring the oil down? I don't understand what's the sane reason to oppose it.
Well, I'm not necessarily opposed to it. Who's opposing it? Trump?
Oh, no. Trump signed it. He's going to we're going to build a pipeline. And my point is not left, right, whatever. Unless you can explain to me how people are going to use less oil by not building the pipeline, then opposing the pipeline is stupid. The pipeline is the safest way, the most environmentally friendly way to move the oil. You can move it on trains, and then they blow up, as we've seen tragically in recent years. You can move it on trucks. Trucks have accidents. The pipeline is the safest way. And this is where I think Trump is aided by his enemies. If they made the more rational arguments against the things they don't like, they would do better. But instead, they go to we got to do something because the Native Americans are going to have a riot. Well, what's that got to do with the economic realities and the science involved?
Well, things become shibboleths, don't they, Michael? And one of those is this travel ban, which turns out to have been from a list given inherited by Trump from Obama, and not including, in either case, neither Obama's list nor Trump's, the fountainhead of terrorism and extremism, namely Saudi Arabia, and the revoking of visas that had already been given to people from those countries. This becomes the occasion of a mass outbreak of opposition, even though if Obama had done it, it wouldn't. These things become shibboleths, don't they?
You're absolutely right. And the number one shibboleth is the phrase in this story is the phrase Muslim ban. I happen to think that the Trump administration botched this badly. I support more individual surveillance. In other words, you see somebody who has done something, maybe posted stuff on the web, and you eye that person rather than group. I think the TSA at the airports is idiotic. It's a clearly show. It doesn't stop terrorism. So I disagree with him, but once again, when critics of whatever in America, the Democrats, scream about a Muslim ban, about a law that allows right now, under the full quote ban, 1 billion of the world's Muslims, the Muslims from every other country except those 7, are free to come to the United States, are free to get a visa. That's the worst. If you're trying to ban Muslims, this is the dumbest ban ever.
Very, very well said. I wish I'd said that.
Well, you probably will.
But
George.
I probably will, George, as Oscar Wilde said. But the point is, it is a very febrile atmosphere in the United States at the moment. At least it looks that way from here, Michael. None of us would be surprised tomorrow if we discovered that some harm had come the way of President Trump, that someone had gone into his office and placed him under arrest. I mean, there's a kind of revolutionary atmosphere abroad, it seems.
I think it's broader. I think it's global. I think you guys are on the front edge of this with the Brexit vote, et cetera. And I say this. I used to run campaigns for a living. Now I work with the Weekly Standard and the Washington Examiner from the journalism side. And when I was running campaigns, you could count on something like a fair hearing. You'd be talking to someone who disagreed with you, and you knew they weren't going to support you. You knew that you would never get their vote. But they were saying, I see your point, but here's mine. I see your point. That moment, it really is feverish. People have just decided, I'm going to hate the other side, and that's on both sides. And whatever you tell me about my enemy, I'm prepared to believe it. And whatever you prove to me about my ally, I'm prepared to ignore it. And it's hard for the center to hold. And I don't mean center necessarily in center, left, and right. I mean center in the sense of there's kind of that civic, national bond or person vision of ourselves as people. It's hard to hold that when people are screaming Hitler versus whatever.
My goodness, you're a good talker and brilliantly, eloquently put. Last question, Michael.
Yes.
If the centre cannot hold, then where does that lead? Are we going to have serious trouble in America? Are we going to have civil disorder, or will this calm down, in your opinion?
I'm counting on what I call the Kardashian effect, which is Americans can only focus on politics for short bursts. We're sprinters, not distance runners. And so eventually we'll be distracted because one of Kim Kardashian's assets will flop out.
A wardrobe malfunction.
Exactly. Or somebody, a kid will get stuck in a well or whatever. And that's what I think. The inherent disinterest of the American people in government, I think, will carry the day, and more voices of people trying to do things in the traditional manner will prevail. The one good thing, though, about Trump, I think, is there was a sense in the heart, like in the middle, that things were just broken. They wanted the whole box kicked over and overturned so you could have a chance to rebuild. And Trump is certainly kicking over the box. You can think that he's breaking a lot of good stuff while he does. I get that argument, but it may actually be healthy over the long. We may look back 30 years ago and go, we needed that moment of kind of chaos,
catharsis,
to regroup about things we believe in.
Well, it's been a great pleasure. I always say it, but I don't always mean it. But I do mean it. Michael Graham, political commentator based in Washington, D.C. Thanks for bringing the first hour to a close, more or less. We're going to continue talking about this in the second and third hours, of course, but we're going to add into the mix the Brexit issue. If ever there was a more miserable parade of parliamentarians on television, on their feet in the House of Commons, telling us how feeble, how weak, how useless we are. How will we survive without the wise counsel of the government of Luxembourg, or the head of the European Commission in Belgium? How are we going to survive without the European Union? Woe is us, we are lost, but we'll have to vote for it anyway. What kind of parliamentarians are these? That's what we're going to discuss, and also the vexed question of Sir Philip Green. It's a miserable parade I'm looking at on my screens around me in the studio, of MPs standing up to justify their defiance of the referendum result on the European Union membership. Let me just make a few things clear that are not yet clear, it would appear. First of all, the Liberal Democrats. Nick Clegg, at the last general election, issued a leaflet with his face on it, in which he said, and the entire leaflet was on this subject, it's time for a real referendum on the European Union. It's time, he said, for the British people in a referendum to decide whether we stay or whether we go. Full stop. Secondly, the British government spent £9 million of your money to circulate to every household a leaflet during the referendum which stated, and I quote, "We are passing this decision to you. We will abide by your decision," unquote, full stop, from Her Majesty's government. Now, there's no room for equivocation on that. There's no wriggle room. The British government, the state, spent millions of pounds telling you that the decision on whether we left or whether we stayed was yours. Article 50, as I have been arguing since the referendum, is axiomatic upon the decision that was taken in the referendum. In other words, the decision that was taken in the referendum cannot be implemented until you trigger Article 50. Therefore, Article 50 should have been triggered on the first day, the day after the referendum, or as soon thereafter as was practically possible. And no member of Parliament had any right to vote against it. None at all. Because the British people had been given the power in the referendum, from the dispatch box, in the document that the British government sent to every household. That's why I opposed the judges. That's why I opposed the cases going before the judges, because it was nothing to do with Parliament anymore. It was nothing, least of all, to do with judges at all, because Parliament, the sovereign Parliament, we keep getting told, had already passed the decision to the British people. So every MP should be in the lobby to trigger Article 50 tonight, but they will not be. First of all, there's Scottish nationalists on their feet saying they're going to vote against it so that they can avoid leaving an undemocratic union that nobody has any power or influence over, in order to get out of a democratic union called Britain, where everybody has a vote in choosing our leaders and our course. Their opposition to the European Union is entirely opportunistic. Their opposition to the withdrawal from the EU is entirely opportunistic. It's only a stick with which they hope to lever Scotland out of the union with England and Wales. And by the way, exactly the same proportion of SNP supporters voted to leave the EU as did Labour supporters in that referendum. 1 million people in Scotland voted to leave the EU. And by the way, the idea that Scottish people want to join the EU and leave Britain so that Scotland can have the so-called free movement of East European labour that England will no longer allow, well, if you believe that, you've never been in Scotland. You don't know many Scottish people. Then there's the Liberal Democrats, hypocrites. Everyone. I've got nothing to say about them. But these Labour people that are, in most cases, doing what they're doing tonight only to cause more problems for Jeremy Corbyn. That's all. If it wasn't this, it would be one of any number of things. But all of the MPs that I have seen, there may be exceptions, have paraded such a pitiful lack of confidence in their own country, in their own people. You'd think that if it were not for the Foreign Minister of Luxembourg, we would be lost. What are we going to do when the Bulgarian and Belgian governments have no longer any care for us? It's enough to make you sick. Let's hear some of the highlights and lowlights of the debate so far. Let's take my old friend Kate Hoey, first of all. She's been getting big stick inside the Labour Party for her stance on Brexit.
I welcome the many letters that I've received from my constituents, many very pleasant letters regretting that I'm going to vote to trigger Article 50. Many, I'm afraid, not necessarily from my constituents, but from across the country in a very kind of nasty, venomous way. And I do resent very much the language and deplore the language that's been thrown around over the last few months.
And then there was the simply berserk contribution from Kenneth Clarke. Now, Kenneth Clarke is, of course, a hush-puppied, civilised fellow who smokes cigars and goes to jazz clubs, but he's been a part of every Conservative cabinet since Margaret Thatcher. He thus is responsible, jointly and severally, for the misery that was brought to this country by every one of those Tory governments. Here's his attitude to democracy. Kenneth Clarke.
Apparently you follow the rabbit down the hole and you emerge in a wonderland. where suddenly countries throughout the world are queuing up to give us trading advantages and access to their markets that previously we've never been able to achieve as part of the European Union. Nice men like President Trump, President Erdogan are just impatient to abandon their normal protectionism and give us access. Don't let me be too cynical. I hope that's right.
More sense was talked by the Right Honourable and one of the few men worthy of the title, David Davis, introducing the bill.
So at the core of this bill lies a very simple question. Do we trust the people or not? The democratic mandate is clear. The electorate voted for a government to give them a referendum. Parliament then voted to hold the referendum. The people voted in that referendum. And we are now honouring the result of that referendum, as we said we would.
My goodness, he's sounding a bit rough, but very clear nonetheless. And what he's saying is absolutely correct. The British people voted to leave the European Union. Full stop. It's a matter for debate, no doubt, what conditions under which we should leave, what the terms on which we should leave, that's all up for debate and will be a major part, let me tell you, of the general election campaign whenever it comes. And if Theresa May drives a rotten bargain, well, that will be just another stick to beat her with in the general election campaign. Or if the people like the bargain that she's driven, equally, it will be a major carrot to the electorate. That's the beauty, you see, of leaving the European Union. We'll now be in charge of our own affairs. You see, we can't vote for the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Neither can we remove him. Yet he and his fellow Prime Ministers are in control of the European Union by definition. They are the 27 other members. They can outvote Britain or outvote France or outvote Romania if they please and as they please, and there's nothing that we can do about it. Here's Gideon Osborne, who blew his nose and stepped up to the mark.
We're not prioritising the economy, although we hope for the best possible arrangement. The European Union is not prioritising the economy either in these negotiations. It is absolutely clear that while they understand that Britain is a very important market for their businesses, their priority is to maintain the integrity of the remaining 27 members of the European Union.
They thought they were being ever so smart, Osborne and Cameron. They thought that they could offer a referendum and then run rings around the people in the course of that referendum campaign. It never occurred to them for 1 second that the British people would take the opportunity that the people of almost every European country would take if the question was put to them. Nobody loves the European Union. Nobody moves for the European Union out of love, only out of interest. I was thinking the other day about Neil Kinnock. When I knew him well, when he invited me to come and live in his house in Ealing, when he brought me down to his constituency house in South Wales and put me on a stage with him to give an address, he was at that time a supporter of unilateral nuclear disarmament. He was an opponent of the European Union, and he really hated the House of Lords. How things changed. We're talking Trump, of course, we're talking the Supreme Court nomination, although one part of me wonders why. What does the American Supreme Court have to do with us? It's one of my issues, you see, that British people, and indeed people in other countries, persist in treating the United States as it would like to be treated, as a country that is exceptional, that is somehow our leader. Sometimes even you think that some people think it's our father. But it's neither our leader nor our father. So one part of me is wondering why we're talking about the American Supreme Court nomination, but I suppose it's of at least academic interest. Of vital interest, however, is what's happening in the House of Commons right at this minute on the passage of the Article 50 bill, the one-clause bill that the government has put and which will be voted on. I think there's more than one vote, but certainly one of the votes is coming up pretty shortly. Now, Peter Wilding is the chairman of British Influence, which is a pro-EU think tank, and he's been good enough to join us now. Peter, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, George.
Now, what is the case for anybody voting against triggering Article 50? I mean, I can see the case for arguing the toss about what kind of Brexit and so on, so on, so on. But Article 50 is merely an axiom produced by the result of the referendum, isn't it?
Well, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, apart from the wonderful, redoubtable Ken Clarke talking about the electors of Bristol speech and how MPs should vote on national interests of their conscience, I think really the issue now is that the MPs have to discharge one duty to the people, and that is, you voted to leave the EU, I'm not going to step in your way. But the battle starts now for them, because whilst Article 50 will be triggered, what happens in the next 2 years is anybody's guess. And with Theresa May getting into bed with Trump, the chances of successful negotiations with the European Union get even more troubled. So a can of worms has been unleashed. Article 50 is just the starting gun of the whole process.
Well, I'm glad we found agreement on that. So let's talk what happens next. I mean, if we're accepting the democratic necessity of triggering Article 50 because of the result of the referendum in June, surely the next step is that the government negotiates the best package, the best deal that it can, and it will be judged on the skill of its negotiations in a general election. Isn't that the proper democratic way of doing it?
Well, it'll probably be judged on the skill of its negotiation before a general election, because Theresa May has agreed that Parliament will have a vote on the deal, and has given them the choice between a rock and a hard place, which is my deal or no deal.
Yeah.
The real battle will effectively to give MPs two further options. One of them is to have a transitional period in the European Economic Area, which we've talked about before, where you control your own borders, but you are still in the single market. Or there's a case going through the Irish courts now. The fourth option is that Article 50, the deal is so rubbish, and the world has changed. Trump's an idiot. We don't want to get into bed with the United States anymore. Europe is our home. You never know, George, what might happen, and the choice might be: this is all a waste of time. Let's revoke Article 50 and stay in the European Union.
Well, of course, but I will argue, if God spares me, that the only proper place for a decision such as that is with the electorate in a general election. And guess what? I think that Theresa May will think that too, because whilst it's possible, and you'll know better than me, you have got a lot of supporters in the House of Commons, even those who are in the lobby with Corbyn and Theresa May this evening. It's possible that you could construct a ramp of people who would effectively blunt the decision to leave the European Union. If it were put to the people in a general election, then we'd know, everyone would know where they stood, and that would be a more democratic way of doing it.
It might be, but George, it's crystal ball time, because even John McDonnell has acknowledged that Brexit changes everything as far as party loyalty and party voting is concerned. He said that in the context of the Copeland by-election coming up. UKIP are challenging in Stoke-on-Trent. In 2020, we might be in a completely different political world. The creaking Westminster, Heath Robinson contraption is responding so lamely to the huge changes that are going on. Something's got to give first, and maybe the next general election is when it happens. I don't know, but I don't know if you feel the same way, George, but I can't see this carrying on quite as it is. And the Conservative Party is going to be judged now. Brexit means Trump. The Conservative government have achieved what they wanted to do for 25 years, which is to have a closer relationship with the US, Republican Party stuff, and to cut ties with bureaucratic Europe to unleash the completion of the Thatcher Revolution. Low tax economy, low regulation economy. Those ships come in. And when people realize that's what's happening, I think election shifts will happen.
Well, maybe not. My money would be on, although it's not the outcome, of course, I would want. My money would be on the Tories being re-elected with a much bigger majority in a general election, especially one fought on the issue of really leaving the European Union rather than being semi-detached about it. However,
yeah,
Peter...
Today, yes, but maybe in 2 years' time, not.
Maybe. We're in the land of maybe, but it's always a pleasure to be there with you. Peter Wilding of British Influence in pro-EU think tank. Now, we're talking Trump, we're talking Brexit, and later we'll be talking Sir Philip Green. But let's take David in Bedfordshire, who's on the line first. Go ahead, David.
Hello?
David.
Hello.
Yes, hello, sir.
Is that George Galloway?
It is, sir, yes.
So I suppose we're different on different, your view is to stay in, haven't you? You remain, aren't you?
No, I'm definitely not a Remainer, David. You need
You're not?
No, you need to...
I am definitely
you need to get with the programme, man. I was one of the leading figures in the campaign for Brexit. I spoke all over the country.
Yeah, but why? Because I phoned up about the other thing, and he said, have a word with George. I said, well, I'm a complete want to come out.
Yeah.
From day one, I want to come out. I'm not worried about an hard Brexit or anything.
Okay, so the Parliament tonight is deciding on Article 50. I've laid out many times my own programme for exit, which consists only of one email. It says, Dear EU, we have decided to leave the European Union and we will not be sending you any more money. From now, our Parliament alone will decide what happens in our country and who can come and live here and who must leave. And our courts will be henceforth supreme. And for your information, Mr. EU, we have no intention of asking anyone from the EU who's currently here to leave. The decision on whether you ask British citizens living in your country to leave is entirely a matter for you. And fifthly, just for your information, we have no intention of having less good environmental, labour and other protections for our people than you have in the European Union, and we will continue to cooperate with you on police and security and all other sensible levels. It's quite easy, just one email.
I've changed my mind about you, my son. That is very, very, very right what you're saying, and I completely agree with you.
Thanks. That never happens often, but I'm glad to say it happened there. David in Bedfordshire, followed by Robert in London. Go ahead, Robert.
Hello, George. Firstly, just I'm going to try to do something quickly on the refugees. We sort of do owe them, funnily enough. I think it's quite rude if you bomb a place into smithereens and you say those people can't come in. The US is partially the reason why they are now refugees.
Well, largely, not just partly, and largely. If it wasn't for the US-led wars against Iraq, against Syria, against Afghanistan, against Libya, against Yemen, then there wouldn't be nearly so many refugees.
It's precisely the reason. Although, in saying that, I find it's not so much that I find the protest tedious, because I think that on the issue itself, I can understand it. It's just the wider aspect of it I find a bit tiresome. Queens had to put up with a lot worse than Trump. You have to put up with real.
Well, we had to put up with George W. Bush and Bill Clinton and President Obama, and that was pretty bad. But first of all, Robert, a lot of these protesters are very young. So for me to say, where were you on the march against the war in Iraq in 2003, invites the answer, well, I was only 13 or I was only 9. So a lot of these protesters are young, idealistic people who hate racism and who hate bigotry. And they don't like the cut of Donald Trump's jib, and who can blame them? The second group are people who were on the marches against Bush and against the Iraq war and so on, and are being more or less consistent, with one caveat that I'll make in a minute. But a lot of it, and certainly almost all of the media coverage, is entirely opportunistic. It's not about a Muslim ban. First of all, such people were never much interested or concerned about Muslims before. And they're not much interested that 6 of them were gunned down in a mosque in Quebec just the other day. There's no Canadian flags, Quebecois flags everywhere to be seen in solidarity with that. And secondly, they are supporters, in many cases, in media, almost all cases, of the very wars that produced the refugee flow in the first place, and have been entirely silent on the fact that Britain is allowing in hardly any refugees at all. As a matter of fact, they talk about a wall, building a wall. We've just built a wall in Calais. Not even in our own country. And we spent taxpayers' money, millions of pounds, to build a wall ourselves at Calais in France. So these people are entirely opportunistic. They are against Trump. It's not that they're supporters of Muslims. And as was pointed out by a Democrat from DC on this show just an hour ago, less than an hour ago, there isn't a Muslim ban. 1 billion Muslims are entirely free to go to the United States. It is only
anything like he said he was going to be in the campaign, to be fair. Well, I should say that's a good thing.
Well, but the point is, it isn't a Muslim ban. 1 billion Muslims are free to come to the United States. It's the people from 7 countries, 5 of which Barack Obama has been bombing, and it's a list of 7 given to Trump by Barack Obama. And so the idea that it's worse to revoke somebody's visa than it is to bomb them, blow their head off, kill their wife, destroy their house, ruin their country, the idea that these two things can be weighed together and one found worse than the other, and that not being war and depredation and destruction, is just ridiculous. They hate Trump. That's the point. Okay, Robert, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Now, Ford has tweeted at George Galloway at talkRADIO, to the unthinking and racists, the travel ban is great, but to the rest of us with sense, it's stupid. And Peter says, Victoria, watch that Mr. Galloway, he's a pattern merchant. Only joking. He adds, Mr. Galloway, why has Mr. Trump not spoken about a 2-state solution for the Palestinians? Well, he has his own reasons. Peter, I have mine. That the 2-state solution is dead. Better forget about it. In fact, there's a fantastic article in Counterpunch this very day. If you look it up, counterpunch.com, I think it is, that you can read about that. But let me talk to Steph in Edinburgh. Steph, by the way, we cannot, for reasons of electoral law, mention the by-elections or the elections in the north of Ireland. So bearing that in mind, Steph wants to talk about the Labour Party, and he's welcome. Steph, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me on, George. It's been a while since we spoke.
It has. What would you like to say?
I've been watching the parliamentary debate for the last 2 days.
Well, better you than me. I've only watched the lowlights.
Well, I'm astounded, George. What's happened to the Labour Party? Once upon a time, the party of the people, for the people, has now, it would appear, you can identify the Blairites very easily.
Oh, yeah.
They're all the ones campaigning against Brexit.
Exactly. And at the same time, raising the banner of ending free movement of labour, which is, of course, an absolute article of faith of the European Union. Talk about hypocrisy. Talk about opportunism. They're on their feet, most of them, because they want rid of Corbyn. Most of them, in fact, everyone I've seen on the news today, every single one, is representing a constituency that voted for Brexit.
That's correct.
In some cases, overwhelmingly for Brexit.
And I'll give you an example. Can I just interject there? I'll highlight, and I'll give you the name, because he did it in the House of Commons. It's a public place. Chris Bryant, do you know what he had the audacity to turn around and say?
Tell me.
That he votes with his conscience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I checked how far back he votes with his conscience. He voted for the Iraq War.
He did. He voted for the Iraq War. He voted for every war. And he is a complete hypocrite. Because
meanwhile,
the one
his
thing...
constituency voted overwhelmingly
for Brexit. I'm not sure he'll be there for all that much longer. But let me tell you how big a hypocrite he is. He declined to vote to censure Saudi Arabia and to put an arms ban on Saudi Arabia while an inquiry was taking place about their conduct in the war in Yemen. Even though that was a Labour three-line whip, he rebelled against it. Now, Chris Bryant, God bless him, is an out gay man. In Saudi Arabia, they throw gays off tall buildings. They cut the heads off gay people. And of course, they have no parliament and no freedom of speech. So as a gay member of a democratic parliament, he refused to obey a three-line whip to stop selling these barbarians guns.
Yes.
And he talks about conscience.
Yes. And that's the hypocrisy of them. And you know what? And as you say, this is not about their actual values and beliefs.
No.
This is about ousting Corbyn.
Definitely.
And which then takes me on to my next thing, right?
Yeah.
Now, I've been doing some research, and I've been doing it for the last few months. And here's something that's never been brought up, or rather I've never heard it mentioned in the whole run-up to Brexit and during these debates over the last 2 days about Brexit. We were lied to in 1974. When I say we, I was only 2 years old, right?
75 it was. 75 it was. I wish I couldn't remember it, but I can.
But my point being, see, since 1972, the whole EEC thing was being debated in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And it was identified early on by Labour ministers that what Edward Heath was proposing to do was to hand over our national sovereignty, all accountability and responsibility to foreign states. Now, I was only 3 years old when we had the original election, right, the referendum result. But I read that the only question that was asked was, should we join the EEC? Nobody was told that all accountability and responsibility of Parliament was being handed across to a foreign state.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I was 21 when the last referendum took place, and I was already quite a prominent political activist in Scotland. And I campaigned behind Mr. Benn, Mr. Foote, and Mr. Shore for a no vote in that referendum, that we should not join the European Union. The great majority of Labour people and trade unions were on our side. We knew that the so-called EEC would become a so-called EU, which would become effectively an unelected, unremovable state.
I recognise it for what it is. It's the Fourth Reich. It's been born out of a failed Third Reich, and they've brought it about by other means, i.e. through debt.
Well, I
means.
wouldn't go that far because that has other connotations, and Germany, of course, is a very different Germany now to what it was briefly in the Third Reich. But what
the one nation state, one nation super state.
Well,
with one government, and that's exactly what it was.
Well, I don't think it's a one nation state, but it's definitely a one government. And that one government is unelected and cannot be removed. And that's what's unacceptable about it.
And that's what terrifies me about what I've seen going on in the last 2 days in the Commons, because these people from the Labour Party, the Blairites, they're all the ones that are under 45, right? They're not serving the people of Britain. They're serving a foreign agenda.
Well, everyone knows what the wages of sin are, Steph. Thanks very much for the call. SH says on Twitter, EU attitude to UK re-Brexit is appalling. They're behaving like insolent teenagers. They dictate to us. We can't negotiate. Well, don't confuse words with actions. And, of course, what's happening now is that a fifth column inside the British state, in Parliament, in the media, in the civil service, in the BBC, in the political machine, and in the majority of the media, is trying to tempt the EU to make the negotiations as difficult as possible so that the deal will be as disadvantageous as possible so that they can then have another referendum. That's their game. I told you that right from the start. Don't say I didn't warn you. That's their game. Even those who say, well, we must respect the decision of the British people, are overtly and, more importantly, covertly trying to tempt the EU into making it all as beastly as possible so that they can have another go in the morning. Now, here's where it might go wrong for them. The EU needs to trade with us just as much as we want to trade with it. That's why in my famous email to the EU, I would make it clear, we have no intention of placing any tariffs or barriers on your goods and services that you sell to Britain. And we don't expect you to put any barriers or tariffs upon ours. German manufacturers, especially motors, want to continue selling in Britain, as do all of the major industrial powers in the European Union. We are a big market. We are 65 million people. We are the fifth or maybe sixth economy in the whole world. Nobody walks away from that kind of a market unless they have a good economic reason for doing so. So I think it'll probably all end up better than is being predicted. And that's why the markets and the currency are as they were in Richard Fletcher's wonderful and wonderfully brief business report earlier on this show. The currency would be through the floor, the FTSE through the floor, if they believed that this was going to lead to economic disaster. Think about it. Don't just be sheeple. Don't just swallow what you're shoveled by the commentators in the so-called mass media. Ignorance is a choice nowadays, you know. You've got a phone. You've got a computer. You can find the truth. The super economic shock jock who's now in the United States, indeed contemplating a run, I'm going to ask him about that, for the US Congress itself. And I'll be talking to him about matters Trump. We'll also be talking in the last hour of the show about Sir Philip Green. The Parliament voted to take his knighthood away, but he intends to keep it. And he thinks he can keep it for years, and that he can continue to avoid paying his dues, that which he owes the pensioners of the business that he helped to wreck, and then retire to one or other of his £100 million yachts, which are based, don't you know, in Monte Carlo, which is where the business was based. And actually, Sir Philip never owned the business. It was owned by Mrs. Green, and Mrs. Green helpfully resided in Monte Carlo, where they pay no tax at all. So, there'll be lots of Philip Green bashing from me. Now, we're talking Trump, of course, and we're talking Brexit, the SNP parading their opportunism. 1 million Scots voted to leave the EU. 3 million Scots would vote not to join the EU, let me promise you, and if you don't believe me, Nicola, call a referendum, why don't you? Call a referendum on leaving Britain to join the EU and enjoy the fruits of freedom of movement of East European labour, all coming to Scotland because they can no longer get into England and Wales. Why don't you, Nicola? Why don't you run a referendum on joining the euro, leaving the pound, joining the euro, if they'll let you, if your currency is in fit shape for it, if your deficit permits it? Why don't you? Now, into the febrile, feverish, near-revolutionary atmosphere in the United States, as we've been discussing earlier with two American commentators, one from the left and one from the right, I interpose the great Max Kaiser, who is a former stockbroker, a man who knows the Wall Street inside out, and who works with me on television, and there is nothing about economics and politics that he doesn't know. And he has just said, or at least suggested, hinted, that he might be poised for an entry into American politics itself. And I've encouraged him because I could think of nothing better than the exocet that is Max Kaiser, who joins us now, I think, by Skype from the United States. Max, welcome to the show.
Hey, George, can you hear me okay?
Very clearly, and I'm very happy to do so. Now, I was talking to somebody from the right, somebody from the left in the United States. Both agreed that these are unprecedented days in the United States where nobody would be surprised if a revolution broke out. The Trump dose of salts that's going through the American political system is producing an awful lot. What's your take on it from there?
Well, George, the U.S. is remaking the world again. This happens every 2 or 3 or 4 generations. The United States remakes the world. And Trump is remaking the world again. It's long overdue. The U.S. was really in a rut. Obama was a disaster. Hillary Clinton would have been certain suicide. So we'll see how it goes. It's going to be a severe test of the Constitution. The Constitution has checks and balances built in. It might not survive, in which case America might collapse. But I think this acid test of the Constitution is needed. I think it was Thomas Jefferson himself who said every 50 years or so there should be blood spilled and a revolution in America to keep it fresh. And so we're at that stage again. And there's a lot of excitement, a lot of interesting things going on.
Well, there certainly is. The clouds are beginning, the smoke is beginning to clear a little bit, but not before millions of people marched in the United States against the outcome of their election, their presidential election. And then there was this tremendous upsurge over the what was described as a Muslim ban, although actually 1 billion Muslims are perfectly free to travel to the United States, at least on the same basis as they were before. But a crazy list of 7 countries has been drawn up, excluding the one state that ought to have been right at the top of any kind of list, namely Saudi Arabia. And the suspicion is, unkind it might be, I think it's probably quite accurate, is because Trump has a lot of business in and with Saudi Arabia, they were left off the list. Can you enlighten us on that?
Yeah, that list was generated in 2015 by Barack Obama, who was the first to put together this type of travel restriction ban. Trump mentioned Syria by name in the executive order, plus other countries that then is a reference to Obama's 2015 list. Now, as far as the omission of Saudi Arabia, I agree with you that this is troubling, and for a number of reasons. Saudi Arabia is clearly the biggest existential threat to the United States. They were, after all, the sponsors of the 9/11 attacks, and they have traditionally been one of America's most ardent foes. I mean, remember the oil embargo of the 1970s, which put the American economy into a complete chaotic tailspin. And their track record on human rights, of course, is appalling. And, I've said many times that the Saudis are by far the most outrageously dictatorial abuser of human rights, probably that's out there in the world stage. So, but I think that with Trump, to make the connection to his business interests, I'm not sure that's necessarily what we can look at here. I think as you can see, his first week and 2 weeks or 3 weeks in the White House, he is basically ripping through dozens and dozens of initiatives and executive orders. And in this case, for the sake of expediency, he picked up on that Obama list of 2015. He added Syria. He put it out there. He is making good on a campaign promise to introduce what he calls extreme vetting. And so that's the way I see it. I don't see it necessarily as a conflict of a business interest. I see it more as he's decided to basically throw the gauntlet down and just rip through and he's not making friends anywhere, really. He's even his own cabinet. You've got Tiller, the new Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, making a comment that he was not comfortable with the fact that he wasn't even consulted on some of these things. So he's really just ripping through, which is what you expect from a change agent. And I think Trump is a change agent. He's going to test the Constitution. He's remaking the world, and has quite a revolutionary feel about it, George.
Now, another thing that I found a bit perplexing is the preoccupation on this side of the pond with which judge sits on the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Frankly, I don't think it's any of our business. But if I was forced to to opine about it, I'd make the observation that it's odd in a democratic country for so much power to be given to judges who are, after all, not elected, cannot be removed, and are there for life. What's your take on this new nominee, and what can we expect to happen with him?
Yeah, it's interesting, the crossover between the two countries. And, of course, in Britain you have the Law Lords in the House of Lords, which is a lifetime appointment that's always been talked about and debated, and what the viability of that is. And I think there's a bit of a crossover there. But remember, the Trump presidency came at roughly the same time as Brexit, and there's a global unrest out there. And we're seeing Theresa May make overtures toward Trump that is not going over well in Britain. I think over 1.5 million people have signed a petition trying to stop Trump from visiting the UK.
Yeah, 1.7 million.
Right. I believe there's a state dinner or a state function being organized at Buckingham Palace. Theresa May, there's a hashtag on Twitter, I believe, called Theresa the Appeaser.
Yeah.
There's tremendous backlash over this, but she's in a tough spot because with Brexit and so-called hard Brexit, she's got to cut deals. She needs deals. Barack Obama told her she would be at the end of the line. Donald Trump has said she'd be at the front of the queue, but of course that would possibly mean giving up state control of the NHS entirely to U.S. and British corporate interests.
Well, it'll be over. That'll be over a few of our dead bodies. I've only got a minute left, Max. Are you contemplating entering U.S. politics? I think you'd be a tremendous agent for change.
Yeah, I'll make a formal announcement in March. But here in the 6th District of North Carolina, there's a seat for Congress that I think I could make a good run at, running as a Democrat, because I think Trump is not getting any pushback at all from the Democrats. And Nancy Pelosi, who leads the Democrats in D.C., is really yesterday's news, not very effective. There's no effective leadership in the Democratic Party. There needs to be some opposition. Trump is, as you point out, with issues like Saudi Arabia, women's rights, and other issues, and the environmental issues, he's completely tone deaf and off base. So there needs to be some opposition. So if I get into Congress as a Democrat in the 6th District of North Carolina, the idea would be to push back on these issues.
And although I can't let you respond because of the time, you could run for president. You could run for president, if not in 2020, in 2024. That's Max Kaiser, the legend, in Carolina, talking to you exclusively about his plans to run as a Democrat for the U.S. Congress. Now, somebody called Rachel Maskell has resigned from Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. Now, I can tell you, with absolute sincerity and honesty, I have never heard of Rachel Maskell. For me, and therefore I'm sure for you, it's another case of somebody we've never heard of resigning from a post we never knew they had. But I'm pretty sure she's done it to damage Jeremy Corbyn, as has the other resignee, Dawn Butler, slightly better known, but only because I've sat in this studio with her. Both of those have resigned from the shadow cabinet. I don't know if they think that that helps the Labour cause. I don't know if they think that that makes it more likely that Labour will win the general election when it comes in 2020 or before. I don't know if they think they're serving their constituents and the Labour movement more broadly by their resignations, but I doubt if they do. Now, Sir Philip Green, the two yachts, the haves and the have-yachts, two-yacht Green, two £100 million yachts. I'm not talking about little sailing ships. I'm not talking about a para-handy puffer or a yacht with a sail. I'm talking super yachts, and he has two of them, £100 million each. He lives in Monte Carlo, but he owned British Home Stores, and he wrecked it. He gave it to a guy for £1 without due diligence, a guy who'd been twice bankrupt and who quickly scuttled that ship, the British Home Stores ship, which had sailed on Britain's high streets for the best part of a century. That would be sad enough because a lot of people lost their jobs. But even worse was the rocks underneath. And those rocks underneath were the pension fund commitment, which could no longer be met. And thus, people who had worked all their lives in some cases for British Home Stores were facing penury instead of pensions. Parliament decided to remove the Sir from his name, but he is refusing to give it up, and he might keep it for years. Let's hear from a man who knows, David Buick, commentator from Panmure Gordon, a smart and clever man, I know. David, how can this be so?
Greetings, George. Well, I think I have to be very careful what I say because Sir Philip is an extremely litigious individual. First and foremost, he has done nothing illegal because the directors of a pension fund of a company of the size of BHS, which represents no less than 22,000 people, that has seen a black hole in its pension scheme grow from £350 million to £571 million. And either nobody has flagged up from the pension trustees, who incidentally have kept remarkably quiet, of why this wasn't flagged up, particularly as everybody knows that BHS was struggling a little bit. And B, nobody in the company thought over the years that they ought actually to divvy up some money. The other thing, George, is that talking about his knighthood, is normally knighthoods are not taken away unless there's been criminal action. And George, he has not been found guilty of anything criminal. There is a massive moral issue here, and I'm sure before everybody jumps down my throat, he can more than afford to repay at least £350 million, because for certain knowledge he has taken a dividend 1 year of £2 billion out in the name of Latina. So the fact is he has the assets. Whether they're particularly liquid or not at the moment, I don't know, and I care even less. But there's no question of whether he can pay it or not, because he can pay it. But he is a natural dealer, and therefore there has been a procrastination, unfortunately, and I think he's been 100% in the right place. Frank Field has irritated him. And he is taking his time to make a decision. And what he has to weigh up in himself is whether he wishes to be personally castigated for the rest of his life, lose his knighthood and keep his money and live in Monte Carlo with his family for the rest of his life, or whether he ought to do the decent thing, step up to the plate, deal with the pension organisers and pay the 350 million over. Toot sweet.
Well, that was very powerfully put in a almost Churchillian, stentorian way. So let me press you on the moral point, because it's not much of a qualification to be a knight of the realm that you haven't done anything illegal. If you've done something which most right-thinking people on a jury or anywhere else would think highly immoral, there must be a means by which the state can withdraw the knighthood. Didn't Sir Fred the Shred lose his, or have I remembered that wrongly?
No, you haven't. You've remembered it absolutely spot on the money. But I think you'll find that it was deemed that the Royal Bank of Scotland had behaved recklessly and irresponsibly in the execution of its business as a bank. In the case of Sir Philip Green, if you recall, and I please don't think I'm condoning this. I'm just talking. I'm talking
absolutely
facts.
Don't. I think you're doing extremely well. Go on.
He sold to Dominic Chappell and others for £1. Now, you and I, we may not be the brightest and sharpest pin in the box, but when somebody sells you something for £1, it's got a little bit of a twist in the tail. And the twist in the tail was that the company was not doing at all well, and Dominic Chappell, whose track record in business was atrocious, felt he could and should do something about it. Where I think this went wrong, and even Sir Philip himself has admitted he should never, ever have sold the business to Dominic Chappell, because it was always going to go down the tubes. But why did a company of the size of Goldman Sachs possibly condone a sale of that nature? They should have told Sir Philip Green, absolutely no way, Jose. Which really endorses the feeling is, I understand why all the members of Parliament who are sitting on this committee, particularly the Pension Committee, that Frank Fields chairs so well, are incandescent with rage and want to strip him of his raiment. And I believe, and I cannot understand for the life of me, why Sir Philip can't see, regardless of knighthoods or anything else, that he, not directly, but indirectly, has ruined 22,000 people's retirement, or severely impaired it if he hasn't ruined it completely, because there is some money in the coffers, and not do something about it when he can afford to, and he knows as well as I do that he has a moral obligation to do so. But trust me, there is nothing illegal that he's done.
Well, I couldn't have put that better myself, so I'm not going to try to. It remains for me to thank you, David Buick, for putting that so clearly and so eloquently. That's David Buick of Panmure. Gordon, I think it is. I've lost the note that tells me exactly. But David Buick put it unbelievably powerfully. There is a moral obligation on Sir Philip, and if he doesn't live up to it, the least that we can do is just call him Phil and take the raiment away. Gary is in Folkestone, and he wants to discuss the protests against Donald Trump. Gary, welcome.
Hello, George. Big privilege for me to speak to you. I'm a big fan of yours.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you, mate.
Yeah, I was just wondering, George, I was watching, obviously I don't agree with Trump with what he's done with this ban on these 7 Muslim countries, but I was just wondering if you think the protests are a bit counterproductive. He sort of it's sort of playing into his hands a bit. I mean, he said on the campaign trail he was going to ban all Muslims. He's not been able to do that. And, you know, I don't know, I somehow see it as if a lot of his supporters will see all these protests as playing into their hands exactly what they want. You know what I mean? They wanted a wrecking ball, and these protesters are making him seem like that's what he is, you know.
Well, I think you've put that very well. I don't know the numbers, though I did see one figure that 59% of American voters approved of Trump's announcement, possibly because they thought it was the announcement that he didn't make, which was the one that he proposed every night in the election campaign, which was a ban on Muslims coming to the United States. It's not. 1 billion Muslims are still entitled to come to the United States. It's a ban on 7 countries, a list that he got from President Barack Obama, who drew it up. And all these liberals, supporters of Obama, supporters of Hillary Clinton, that are having a fit of the vapors about it, would have been better advised having that fit when Obama drew up the list in the first place.
Yeah,
but
no, exactly.
I've got no doubt that it's strengthening Trump's position with his base, because he has excited all kinds of Islamophobic feelings, which led to, amongst other things, in Quebec, an act of mass murder by someone who said that they were a supporter of him and a supporter of Vichy Le Pen in France, and a supporter of, for that matter, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. Now, none of these 4 people are responsible for what this mass murderer did, but that's the trap out of which he was running, if you get my Greyhound reference.
Exactly.
The reality is that every country has a right to decide who comes in to its territory. We have it, and we exercise it. We've just built a wall, would you believe, at the cost of millions of pounds of British taxpayers' money, not even in our own country, but in Calais. Every country gives out visas, and every country has the right to revoke them. I think Trump's ban is stupid. I think it's stupid for a number of reasons. First of all, you cannot say that 7 whole countries full of people are a security risk. You have to treat each person on their merits or their demerits. So it's collective punishment on 7 countries, 5 of which the United States, under President Obama, have been bombing. 3 bombs an hour, every 20 minutes. And it's stupid also because it doesn't include the one country from which most of the terrorism is coming, either directly from Saudi citizens, 13 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11, for example, or because it is people who are motivated by the ideological, theological mindset, which is the hegemonic in Saudi Arabia. And they are given money and weapons and material and propaganda and other support from Saudi Arabia. So,
what do you think he didn't ban them from Saudi Arabia? Do you think it's to do with intelligence, or do you think it's money and all?
I think it's money, but I asked Max Kaiser this. It's probably not. Max thinks it's not. A direct relationship. Well, I've got a golf course in Saudi Arabia, so I better not put them on the list. It's probably not as crude as that, but it's because Saudi Arabia has $6 trillion in the United States. Trillion. In the banks and in the stock market and in the property markets in the United States. And so it's probably money.
The same reason we don't ever say anything about them, isn't it, really? Well, you know what I mean? It's just...
I think that's a perfect rejoinder, Gary. It's the same reason that we continue to kiss their noses, because of money. Gary, thanks. Been a pleasure talking to you. Let me go to Nicola on the Donald Trump and Philip Green questions. Nicola, welcome.
Thank you very much, George.
Welcome. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think Donald Trump should come to this country. He's spoken of hatred in his own country. He'll stir up more hatred when he comes here. He won't just sit in the corner and say nothing. He'll stir up hatred. He's bound to say something. And America's supposed to be the land of the free, and he's restricting it for these countries without good reason, as you say. There's a few terrorists in each of those countries, but there's an awful lot of refugees, and we've got a humanitarian crisis on our hands, and he should be helping sort it, not antagonise it.
Well, there have been no refugees have killed anybody in America. But in the last 72 hours, 6 Muslims were gunned down, 5 were left in intensive care, 60 were hurt by a supporter of Donald Trump, by a white Christian nationalist. No refugee in the United States has ever killed anybody in the recent past. So it's a stupid method. It's a blunt instrument.
These are people who have been forced out of their homes. Their families have been killed. They've trekked halfway across Europe. They need help.
Well,
America's got a lot more space than us to take them in.
But Nicola, we've got to separate these two issues. There's refugees, and America has as much of a duty, if not much more, than all other countries to receive refugees.
And you should be welcoming them.
That's illegal.
You should be welcoming these countries.
As should Saudi Arabia, which has taken no refugees at all, even though they are up to their necks in the bloodshed that's producing the refugees. But that's a separate question. That's a separate question. In terms of visas, these are not refugees. These are people who want to travel to the United States. Now, nobody has a right to travel to the United States. Nobody. Most people have no need to go to the United States. I've been myself everywhere in the United States. I've spoken north, south, east and west in the United States. They have the pleasant tradition there of paying you at the end of your speech, I must say, which doesn't happen here very often. But I have no need to go to the United States, and if the United States said that they didn't want me, I would have to accept that. As a matter of fact, I'd accept it gladly because I have no wish to go there. But to say that an entire class of people, all Iraqis, all Syrians, all this, all that, cannot come, it's foolish. Not least because, Nicola, it will create more radicalization, more extremism, more fanaticism, and give the Al-Qaeda and ISIS recruiters more swampland to recruit in. It's kind of obvious. It's not rocket science.
No. Then he's going to upset the poor Islamist people who live in the United States, who are working there now for his country. He's going to be upsetting them. How would you feel if your family can't come and visit you?
Well, that happens here, of course. I spent almost 30 years trying to get Muslims a visa to come to Britain to visit their family. Trust me, it's not very easy. So this didn't start with Donald Trump, and it's not confined to the United States. Nicola, been great to talk to you. Let me try and squeeze some more calls in. There have been plenty trying to get through. Here's Malcolm in Brighton. Go ahead, Malcolm.
Hello there. Hello, I'm in Brighton, sunny Brighton. Yeah, I think it's really sad, really, because really this person's saying all Muslims are terrorists and things like that. I personally think it's a bad move on his account, really, because you get good in any religion and any colour, and I think he's going to cause a lot of problems in America. And I also think that when he comes over here to see the Queen, it's going to cost a lot of money to police all this.
Well, I'm a veteran. I've got the medal of the great anti-George Bush marches and protests when Bush came. I don't know if you remember, but the skies over London were black with American military helicopters. Can you imagine? They even brought their own sniffer dogs. Like our sniffer dogs were not up to the job. It was, I thought, a grave national insult to our canine population. But we never got any support at all from the mass media, even though we had a march in a weeknight in the dark, which was the biggest weeknight demonstration ever held in British history, but we could hardly get on the news. The Trump protests, on the other hand, have been given fantastic publicity, because there are a lot of people jumping on the bandwagon and misleading people. There is no, Malcolm, there is no Muslim ban. There's 1 billion Muslims still free to go to the United States. But it is a stupid blanket ban on 7 countries. A list of 7 drawn up, I keep saying, by Barack Obama, who incidentally deported more people than any American president in history. Barack Obama deported 2.5 million people from the United States. That's almost 1 million more than George W. Bush did. So look not at the mote in the eye of your brother before attending to the beam in your own eye, I would say, to the supporters of Obama and Clinton. But I agree with you, Malcolm. It's a very stupid approach that can only create more terrorists.
Well, this is what I was saying, George. I mean, I know you went over there because you met President Hassan, didn't you?
President who?
Did you met the president in Iraq, didn't you?
Yes, his name was Hussein, yes.
That's Hussein, sorry. Well, I think it's terrible, and I think a lot of, see, the thing is, it's going to cost a lot of money to police all this, and the thing is, they didn't find anything over there, as you well know. They all went over there and didn't find anything, and the thing is, it's about segregation, isn't it? It's about power. I personally believe, and this is my own opinion, the only reason why they went over there is for the oil.
Of course they did, that's right. It was very silly of Theresa May to issue this invitation to Donald Trump. It would be even sillier if Donald Trump were to come, because if 1.7 million people have signed a petition to ban him from the United States, can you imagine how many are going to turn out in protest if he actually comes here? And that's if he keeps his mouth shut. If he opens his mouth and erupts, as I think is endemic in his personality, then God knows what will happen. The Queen doesn't have enough soldiers to protect him. There's not enough police officers in the Metropolitan Police to protect the Mall if he were to come down it in an open carriage. God knows what would happen to him.
No.
It's a really stupid idea.
It is a silly idea, and the thing about it is, George, is what's happened is they've cut the police force down anyway in this country. They've cut it down because it's saying it's too expensive and everything else. I think I personally think also he's a puppet for Russia as well. And I think it's really sad because in all this Muslim business, I mean, there's good Muslims and there's good Irish people. It's class in everybody. And I agree with you. 1.5 million people are against him coming over here. What about democracy? Doesn't the government, Theresa May, listen to what the people are trying to tell her?
Well, she's bound to have had the message by now that any state visit by Donald Trump will be opposed by a very large number of people.
Of course.
But I want to press you on something that you just said. You say he's a puppet of the Russians. That would be quite an achievement for Russia to have a president of the United States as their puppet. Why do you say that?
I just personally think he's a puppet because apparently he went over there and they were telling people. But I don't know. I think he's a puppet to somebody. I mean, he may be a good businessman, but he hasn't got a really good brain. And the thing about it is he's all right on the reality show, but he's dealing with people, millions of people in America, lives. And it's the same with Theresa May here. She's dealing with, millions of people's lives. And it's all they're thinking about is selling arms.
Well, indeed. He's smart enough to have made whatever money he's made. I persist in thinking that he's made far less than he claims. He's smart enough to have won the presidency of the United States against the Democratic Party and against the Republican Party. He was smart enough to work out that an economic policy that appealed to the devastated so-called Rust Belt states would be a pathway to the presidency. All the experts, all the pundits, all the politicians said that the pathway was too narrow, that he could never do it, but he did it. So he's definitely not stupid. Furthermore, Malcolm, to promise better relations with Russia is not only not being a puppet, it's common sense, because bad relations with Russia could lead to a nuclear confrontation. And if Clinton had been the president, that might well have been where we would have ended up. I think we've dodged a mushroom cloud by not having Hillary Clinton. So I repeat my position, Malcolm. I'm not happy that Donald Trump is the President of the United States, but I'm very, very happy that Hillary Clinton is not.
Exactly. Likewise. And I think, a lot of people out there voted for him because the way Clinton and all this other lot, George Bush and everything behaved, they don't trust a lot of the people.
And that's the same reason they voted for Brexit, Malcolm. Because they hate the political class and they're right to hate them. What's not to hate? Malcolm, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
The way Clinton and all this other lot, George Bush and everything behaved, they don't trust a lot of the people.
And that's the same reason they voted for Brexit, Malcolm. Because they hate the political class and they're right to hate them. What's not to hate? Malcolm, it's been a pleasure talking to you because I have to break off now because the master is in the room and his
James is here as well.
And his assistant, his apprentice. This is surreal. This is surreal, James. I'm handing over the microphone to you. It is a great honour for me, sir.
George,
James Will.
Excuse me.
And Ash.
Having him there. It's a pleasure to see you there in control, George, after all these years. You there in the main seat. Now listen, George, when are we going to start a new political party? Politics is falling apart. Politicians are not answering the will of the people, whether it happens to be Brexit or Trump or anything else. We're in a very difficult situation.
Well, you're onto something there. I think that the political parties are falling apart, and certainly people's love for them has disappeared like water down a drain. Aaron Banks is starting something called the People's Movement. We'll need to see the cut of that jib and the colour of that.
Galloway.
The
Galloway Party.
The Galloway Party.
Yeah.
Patent that.
That was good. Don't
patent
cut my mic
that
after
right
that.
now.
Make
that
my mic
was
louder.
very clever.
I apologise.
The Galloway Party.
Now listen, before we go on, and we're going to talk a bit about the funding of the NHS. You were talking about that, I think, as well.
Yes.
And Sir Philip Green. We're going to carry
Sir
on with that.
Sir Philip Green.
Now, but before all of that, the most important thing, George, that I want to get from you is the rolling of your R's.
It's a very great skill.
It
that
is.
Only a Scotsman.
It accentuates your speech,
Yeah.
isn't it? It's a professional thing, isn't it?
It is. Some people say that after 35 years in London, that I no longer sound Scottish, but I think I sound very Scottish.
You do, George. You do. You do. Yes, you do.
So you've got the NHS. What else have you got, Jamesy?
Well, we tried to get a couple of, a lot of members of Parliament very vocal about Sir Philip Green losing his knighthood, and now they've all gone to ground. So we're going to name and shame some of those. We're also going to, a little more light-hearted later in the evening, Doctor Who, male or female?
I think Francis de la Tour would be a wonderful Doctor Who. But I have to hand over the conch to you now because it's my out time. The great, the really great, Sir James Will. Sir James Will is up next with Ash.
OBE.
Without whom there is no show.
Exactly.